All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this first webinar in the webinar series of the Democratizing Work chapter of the Netherlands. This afternoon, we will be talking about labor precarity with Ronald Dekker from the TNO Institute, Valeria Pulignano from the KU Leuven in Belgium, and Valeria Pirot from the University of Milan. But first, we will have a short presentation about what actually the Democratizing Work group is and what it's about, what the project is doing. And that short presentation will be given by Max Visser. So maybe first up, we'll give the floor to Max.
Although Lisa is actually more entitled to give such a presentation because she was there from the beginning, but shall I do it, Lisa, or won't you do it, or? No, okay. Just a brief presentation. Democratizing Work is a global network of scholars, activists, and practitioners interested in a better, more just, and more sustainable future of work. And it's quite a young organization. It's now almost in existence for 2 years, except for the preparatory phase. And during the first Corona lockdowns, we issued a manifesto on the future of work. It was published in 36 countries, and it has since then garnered more than 6,000 signatures. It seemed that in that first lockdown, that was a very appropriate period to start thinking about, very fundamentally start thinking about the way the world is going, especially the way of work in the world. So it was a huge success, and we have been building on that since then. That manifesto calls for 3 things: democratization, decommodification of labor, and decarbonization of work. And the session of today will be the first one about the democratization of work, and of course also a bit about the decommodification of work. And these principles in that first manifesto are currently further elaborated in books, articles, and a lot of publications, especially by some of the founding persons of the group, which we are situated in Harvard. We've been working on the book in different languages, also some articles passing by in organizational theory and other important outlets. So there's quite some work is going on. And also in October 2021, we had a first global forum on democratizing work, a worldwide Zoom event, one might say, a digital conference with more than 3,000 participants from 85 countries. And what we want to witness today is the first webinar of the Dutch chapter of Democratizing Work, which will be about labor precarity in the Netherlands, totally fitting subject in the whole of the Democratizing Work field. So with that introduction, I give the floor back, as far as that is physically possible, to Tim to further monitor and chair this session. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Max. So I'm actually going to give the floor right back to someone else. So we'll start with the presentation of Ronald Dekker.
Okay, I will start sharing my screen then. And if it all goes well, you will now see a person balancing on a wire, which is a characterization of the labor market and its precarity. And I was asked to give you a brief introduction on my views on precarity on the Dutch labor market. So here we go. To give you, I'm working at TNO Institute at the unit Healthy Living, which is where the people are concentrated that are working on labor market issues and labor organization issues. So we are in total with a group of around 120 researchers at this Institute for Applied Research. And I have been working there for almost 2 years now. And before that, I worked at Tilburg University, the TU Delft, and before I went to TNO at the Dutch Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment. And my research when working at the university was on, well, let's say labor precarity. We called it differently back then. but it's essentially what is labor precarity. It's about insecure employment, non-regular employment, flexible employment, what have you. So my PhD, which started at Tilburg University in 1997, was concerned with the transitions that people make on the labor market from flexible forms of employment to more permanent forms of employment. And I investigated research questions on the basis of panel data for 3 European countries, namely the Netherlands, the UK, and Germany. After that, I went to work at the TU Delft and was concerned with how flexible labor in organizations impacted their capacity to innovate. So I worked with the likes of Alfred Kleinknecht and other colleagues on issues. How does an organization with a large share of flexible employment, is it more or less capable of bringing to the market innovative products? Is it more or less capable of being more productive? And then I returned to Tilburg University and headed a large research program on employment security with colleagues Tom Wildhagen, Garissa Freze, Irmgard Borghouts, who are all still at Tilburg University. And we were concerned with the concept of employment security, which is, well, actually the complement of the employment insecurity, which we now call precarity, at least in my view. And also within that period, I worked on a research project on the lack of inclusion. So the lack of employment security large groups in Dutch society have, because they are essentially not included into the labor market. This was research that was done before the current Participation Act started. And we sort of predicted in that study that this Participation Act was not going to reach its goal of more inclusion into the labor market of vulnerable groups. And sadly, this turned out to be an adequate prediction, which, well, as an economist, you're always happy when you have an adequate prediction somewhere, but this is not a very nice one. So, as I said, I'm working on precarity issues for the past 20, 25 years without exactly calling it precarity. So in my book...
Ronald, I'm shortly interrupting you because we are still on your first slide.
Oh my goodness. I have to see if I can change that. I will share screen again. And then do it like this, because I'm on this slide now.
Yeah. Now
does that work? Yeah. If I make it full screen, I cannot click it anymore, I'm afraid.
Okay. Yeah.
So, I'm sorry about that. What precarity is in my book is something that people experience themselves, so they can feel precarious when working or not working, and you have all kinds of subjective notions of insecurity or precarity, what have you. And the research I talked about earlier is on what you can actually observe from data sets is the actual, or let's say objective level of insecurity. How likely are you to lose your job? How likely are you to find another job? So there's a more objective way of looking at precarity. In all of the precarity literature, you can see that it's related to income insecurity or security, job security or insecurity, and employment security or insecurity. And there are various terms going around. So we talk about precarity, we talk about precariousness, we talk about labor precarity, as we do in this webinar. And one of the things I found in the recent literature is talk about precarious employment, which I think is a meaningful term. And I will show the next slide now to see that this term is coined by Crespy and others in a 2020 paper. in the Journal of Work, Environment and Health. And then precarious employment is based on 3 pillars, which is employment insecurity, the inadequacy of income, and the lack of rights and protection. So I think this is a meaningful operationalization of precarious employment, which has the benefit of breaking it down in 3 different dimensions, which in itself are useful. So the only thing I don't find clear is that income inadequacy could be due to the income level, as Chris Pye and others have denoted, but it could also be that the income inadequacy is related to the income insecurity, which is inherent in your current job. So if you're solo self-employed, if you work through a temp agency, you have a sort of inherent insecurity about the level of income that your work will generate in this week or in the next week. So it's not just the low level of income, it's also the insecure level of income that I would think that is important. So if we take this breakdown and look at what we find in the Netherlands with respect to this breakdown, we see that a sizable part of the workforce in the Netherlands is on temporary or otherwise flexible contracts. This is including solo self-employment. And for some people, this is a phase they're going through. This is not this is a term I use in one of the chapters of my PhD. For a lot of people, they use flexible labor as a stepping stone towards permanent forms of employment. So still about 1/4 of the 35% who is in temporary or otherwise flexible employment is sort of remaining in this flexible periphery of the labor market. So they will find other jobs, but they're flexible again. So this is what I would call the precarious part of the labor market. At least this is the base. The people that continue in work, but are insecure about whether they have this work next month, next year. But if we go to the dimension of income inadequacy, then you also find a lot of low income or working poor even in what we call regular employment. And this is mainly due in the Netherlands to people working very few hours per week. So as the first part-time economy of the world, 2/3 of women and 1/3 of men in the Netherlands work part-time. And if you have very few hours, then you're very likely to have inadequate income, especially if you are responsible for other household members with that labor income. Well, the same is true also for the lack of rights. You also find that in regular employment, but this is not a major phenomenon on the Dutch labor market. Then, so to illustrate this a bit more, this is a graph I've made many times before, and this is the recent one. This is the relative size, the relative share of flexible employment in the Netherlands. And the different colors mean the different kinds of flexible employment that you can distinguish in the Netherlands. So there's temporary work, there is temp agency work, and the big blue bars on top are solo self-employed. And then if you look to the utmost right of the picture, then you think, whatever happened in 2021 with the Dutch labor market and the flexibele schil, as we call it? Well, this is a change in the definition in the labor force survey and nothing more. So it's not a COVID thing, it's not an economic crisis or what have you. This is just redefining the different contracts, or redefining the routing and the way labor market status was questioned in the labor force survey. So I would still argue that about 1/3 of the Dutch labor market is flexible and therefore to some extent insecure, and for some part even precarious. Then this was recognized as a problem about, let's say, 10 years ago. Before that, we all thought this was a very good development, that the labor market was becoming more flexible, so more people could enter, and it would reduce unemployment and it would increase employment and what have you. And only in 2012, let's say, there was a sort of a turnaround in the thinking that the insecure characteristics of the Dutch labor market were problematic. So, and this was due to the Great Recession that we had back then. And there were policy efforts since then to sort of rebalance the labor market. So we make flexible labor less flexible, and we make permanent contracts less permanent. That was the idea. And we had two major policy packages, one in 2014, which is called the Labor and Security Act. And more recently, we had the Balanced Labor Market Act by the previous government. Then they were all trying to do sort of rebalance the labor market to make it, well, let's say more, somewhat less flexible and somewhat less insecure. So currently the policy debate is focused on income and wealth inequality, mainly also fueled by the work by Piketty and others. But in that discussion, not sufficient attention is given to the income inequality producing effects of the labor market itself, because a more flexible labor market does produce more income inequality. So there is, and not enough policymakers do recognize that. And on the side, we have this maybe somewhat over focus on platformization and pseudo self-employment, and on the one hand, and a long overdue attention for the working poor, which can also be found in permanent jobs in the Netherlands, I'm reluctant to say. Well, so what are the problems for precarious workers? It's the low income, it's also the insecurity about the income, it's the employment insecurity per se. So more people are longer dependent on forms of flexible employment than well, let's say 20, 30 years ago. And this is an unsafe context for development. So if you want people to develop themselves in work, you have to provide a bit more security than currently 1/3 of the Dutch labor market is having. So if you don't know whether you have a job tomorrow, what's the point of getting better in this job? And all of the above are associated or correlated problems that define precariousness. So it's a bit of circular reasoning there, but I think that's just the way it is. So finally, to come to a conclusion here, what's the way forward? Well, from TNO, we have promoted a so-called skills approach to the labor market. So we actually do not, I'm not really concerned with precarity as such, but we do want a labor market that facilitates informal learning and skills development a bit more. And therefore, it would be helpful if the labor market was less precarious. That would enable positive mobility on the labor market and enabling the great transitions that we need as a society with respect to climate and energy, first and foremost. And it's a sort of a precondition that we need less precarious work in order to make that work. So that was all for me. And I don't know if I'm allowed questions in between or we go to the next presentation, but I'll leave that to you, Tim.
Yeah, so we do have time for questions between the presentations. So thanks, first of all, for your talk. Let's give him a round of applause. To Ronald, maybe if you could stop sharing your screen, yes. That will be easier for questions. So for your questions, you can either post them in the chat or you can raise your hand. So, yeah, Lisa.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting. I wanted to ask you a bit more about who is it that ends up in precarious labor? Is it very much people from a specific socioeconomic layer? So, for example, would it make sense to speak about social classes again, given that kind of labor market? To what extent is it people with a migrant background? And to what extent is it also sort of eating into highly educated fields of work? So people who would, expect that they will have a proper job and then they end up having that kind of precarious employment. Could you say a bit more about these things?
Yes, I think I can. Precarious employment is there for everyone, for the young, for the old, for the high educated, for the low educated, for migrant workers, for non-migrant workers. But there is an overrepresentation of younger workers, overrepresentation of women, overrepresentation of migrant workers, low educated workers, especially when you look at the people that remain in flexible, precarious employment. So the people that are constantly in flexible or let's say precarious employment, in that field, you have an overrepresentation of low educated female workers, migrant workers, people with disabilities, and so what have you. So that's what it is, and my impression is that that is true for most European labor markets.
Okay, there's a question in the chat. I'll read it for you. So it says, Guy Standling's book, The Precarious, uses these distinctions to articulate a new type of class division vis-a-vis a new bourgeoisie in the knowledge class or cognitariat.
Yeah, and therefore I make an addition because what you see in the analysis is that high educated people that work, for instance, in media, in journalism, are also part of the precariat. So so you do find some high educated workers there, and I was asked a long time ago to give a talk at the Dutch School for Journalism, and they asked me about their prospects on the labor market, and I told them basically don't do it, because the only thing you find on this labor market is precarious employment. So please be aware that if you want to be a journalist, this is going to be your life. And so it's not restricted to the low educated, but there are some sectors, some occupations that are so heavily flexibilized that going into that direction means you will have precarious work at best.
Okay, I see Patricia also has a question. Do you want to pose it yourself or should I?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ronald, for the presentation. This is very, very clear and interesting. I was wondering how the public conversation, you mentioned that in 2012, the conversation about flexibility changes. And could you give us some background as what were the elements that led the conversations to shift? Also because, well, I'm speaking from Belgium, and in Belgium, actually, the Netherlands is always used as a good example that we didn't follow, right? We kept protecting and we are so unflexible, and that's why we have a dual labor market. And so now it's very interesting when you kind of come back on your decision in a way, or maybe not, but also for us then to learn something out of it.
I was actually called by a news program in let's say 2013 or something, and they asked me what has happened, because there seems to be predominantly negative connotation about flexible labor now, whereas in previous years we had a most of all positive connotation. So I said I recognize that there has been a shift. And my explanation would be that since we are in a long and very deep recession, more and more people find out what are the drawbacks of flexible labor and what are the risks and the insecurities that come with flexible labor. So let's say in 2008, everybody was convinced that this flexible labor meant it was relatively easy to enter the workforce. And that was a good thing. And in 2011, 2012, it made it very easy to be kicked out of the labor force again. And so that dominated. So it's the business cycle basically, which turned around the discussion and the debate. And when I pointed out the risks of flexible labor and the insecurities associated with flexible labor in 2005, 2006, when I nearly finished my PhD, then I was a sort of the odd one out. And in 2012, everybody understood what you were saying, even though it was the same thing that you said 6 years earlier.
Okay, so let's give Ronald another round of applause. And then we can move to Valeria Pulignano.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll also try to share the screen and see whether it works. Do you see it? Yeah, okay. Let's hope that it will not stuck like Roland one. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for having me with you today. It's a pleasure. Also, as you know, one of the let's say member of the Belgium team for democratizing work. So it's interesting to have this interaction with the Dutch team. Okay, who I am? I'm a sociologist. I'm a sociologist of labor. Actually, I define myself a labor scholar because I have expertise, apart from work on employment industrial relations. I'm an industrial relations scholar, labor market, and I use, and my work actually is very comparative across different European countries. And this is what I have been doing, you know, in my work. Particularly, I've been focusing a lot on working conditions, and this is in fact where this linkage to precarity comes from. Job quality, working conditions and pay, and in the line of the democratizing work agenda, work as voice. I've been working a lot on information and consultation rights for workers at different levels, not only within you know, national, local works councils, but also at the European level. I've been participating a lot in strengthening the participation of workers' agenda at the European level, also particularly in situation of change. And here I talk particularly the multinationals, companies change in terms of restructuring. But recently I've been also very much you know, trying to link the work agenda with the family agenda or life agenda, if you like, in the sense that as part of my recent work, I'm also trying to kind of going behind the idea of precarity being only related to income and work as paid work, but also trying to link it to pay. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I suspect we have the same problem.
Oh, sorry. I'll try to then. Yeah, sorry. Well, then I have to do like. Wait, I'll. Try
yeah, now it moves.
Way.
Now it moves.
Does it work in this way? Do you see it?
Yes, now it does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. Good. Sorry. No, I was just saying that since the last years, I've been trying also to link behind the paid work agenda when you look at precarity at work, and also trying to establish relationship and interdependencies with domestic work and particularly family life. Very much, you know, in connection with the social reproductive work. And as part of that, I will try today to dig into one aspect of precarity I've been particularly working since the last years as part of the ERC Advanced Grant Respect Me, which is in fact on unpaid labor in platform work, which is in fact, I think, one important, although not very much kind of recognized as such, but one of the most important aspects creating precarity for workers working in the platform economy. Now, let me say, first of all, why I am and we are interested, or we should be interested in unpaid labor. Well, first of all, because platform work is a particular kind of work. It's work which is mediated, we know, through digital technologies. People talk about algorithm management. There is a lot of automation out there. And in this way, there is a lot of hidden work that is in fact value, which is produced and is not really redistributed equally across, let me use the word capital and labor, and particularly within the labor workforce. So this is very much to do, according to me, to the fact that in fact, where and how and when work as platform work is undertaken is quite, again, not very well known. People think platform workers are, empowered, they are free, they are self-employed, but de facto they are not. And I will try also to show up in the way in which this not comes across, in the sense that this freedom, again, is just a kind of coverage of the way in which platform work, but de facto then people don't have a lot of capacity and particularly discretion on the conditions of their own work, so they cannot decide autonomously about what do I do, when do I do stuff, and how. And this is why I do think it's important to empower workers in platform work, trying to uncover the kind of needs they have, and trying to attribute to them rights. And I will try also to shed light on this aspect. Now, I would like to start, since we talk about unpaid labor, unpaid work, I would like to start with this example. I'm sure everybody knows about this. This was an interesting UK decision that was reached by the British court, which reached, in fact, a decision regarding how to calculate Uber drivers' working time. So how to determine when drivers are working for Uber, and thus they are entitled to have accrued wages and benefits. And at that time, the
I'll have to interrupt you again. We're still on slide 3. I'm not sure. Yeah. So...
I don't know. Well, then I have to go back and use these like Roland did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. We'll do like this. Now, I just wanted to say that this court case, I mean, it's quite interesting in the sense that what the British court decided is that, in fact, work time is very important in the Uber context and includes more than the time when a driver is transporting a passenger from pickup to destination, and more than the time when a driver has accepted the fare and is driving to the pickup location. So in other words, what the court decided here is that working time is time, whatever kind of time a driver is logged in and available to accept a ride. And this is time which needs to be paid. Now, why do I say this? Because working time, as I will show in a minute, is one of, although not only, one of the most important driving factors of unpaid labor in platform or work. Now, let me, just give a bit of information about how we have been kind of conducting the research on unpaid labor in platform work. As I said, this is part of an ERC grant and also an FWO. We have been conducting a lot of interviews with workers and also expert interviews. And we have been also collecting working diaries with workers where they have been reporting the kind of activities they were undertaking in the different days for a length of 10 working days. In a kind of nutshell, I will give some preliminary information about the outcomes that we reached. Now, if you remember at the very beginning, I said that unpaid labor, in fact, comes from the lack of, if you like, discretion, autonomy that workers they have on when, how, and where do they work. And this comes, in fact, across all the different sort of different platforms we have been looking at. Particularly, we see in food delivery having an important aspect. Well, here we see that employment status is very important. So the called, misclassification of the workers is one of the reason for unpaid and therefore of the lack of autonomy workers they have. But also we do see here that the way in which platform also conducts their own activities, for example, the establishment of piece rate system, it also contributes a lot for this unpaid. And there where piece rate system doesn't exist, we see, and where workers are also recognized employees, we see that unpaid labor can occur. So self-employment and employment status, and therefore reclassification, is only one little aspect of the story here, because we see that also no guaranteed minimum working hours and shifts reduces, in fact, the discretion of workers on pay. For the freelancers that we have been talking to, we see that here, particularly lock-in effects and absence of portability of their own CVs and portfolio also reduces the capacity of discretion and autonomy over pay for freelancers. And for care workers working on care platform, we see that here the deprofessionalization and digital visibility of care workers reduces this discretion of self-regulating their own pay and so forth. Now, in this presentation, I won't have the time to go through all these three work areas. I will only concentrate on food and freelancers. Now, how we define unpaid labor? Unpaid labor is here defined as workers' effort outside a fixed work time and production. And basically means kind of having the kind of no capacity, in fact, to get grasp or grip on these kind of issues like working time and means, in terms of means which are used for working, which normally are recognized under a situation of standard employment, and on which, in fact, workers lack discretion. Now, we have been investigating these different platforms across different countries, so the study is very comparative. And as you can see here, the Netherlands is also part of our comparative research. Now, let me go into very quickly into some of our findings. Here you see a kind of classification. We have been really kind of checking, and ticking the boxes of the form of unpaid, so uncovering the different forms of unpaid that workers they do across the different, if you like, lines between working time and no working time unpaid. And you can see here, you have also the dimension, the names of the platform we have been investigating. You see, in fact, there is a big of differentiation in the different forms of unpaid workers are engaged in. A lot of working time unpaid, particularly we see very relevant for a platform like Deliveroo and Glovo, that they work, in fact, under this kind of piece rate system. For platform like Takeaway and My Menu, where this piece rate system doesn't exist, we see that unpaid is particularly related to the kind of guaranteed, which is given to the working hours and shift. And here comes, in fact, our one of our main conclusion regarding the food delivery workers. So we see that unpaid work, especially in the form of waiting time, is prominent under this piece rate payment system, is a bit mitigated in platform with hourly payment system, but nevertheless is still present there, although mitigated, because in fact is results of this not giving guaranteed for working hours. We also see that regulatory mechanism exacerbate this kind of situation. And here I want to point out particularly the Belgium case, where we see that the so-called peer-to-peer status, which is a very particular kind of status which was introduced by the Belgian government at a certain point, then it was revised by the the Belgian constitutional the legal setting. So basically this kind of P2P status exacerbate a lot, creates a loopholes where platform eats a lot, and also exacerbate the situation of unpaid for workers. For crowd and freelancing, what do we see here? In crowd work and freelancing, unpaid labor, let's say that is squeeze a bit, one might actually argue, it takes less straightforward shape than waiting time. But let's say that anyhow, we see a lot of unpaid hours which are spent by freelancers. Well, freelancers have always, done unpaid, spending a lot of time in searching for jobs and also doing job application, doing many other stuff. But what we see here particularly is that now, and this is the result of the funding of the study, people invest a lot, but what they get out of it is really not enough to have ends meet. So this creates a lot of precarious situation for freelancers. And this situation of precarity is even more exacerbated under a situation of what? First of all, under situation of regulatory settings, where we see that a lot of differentiation exists in different regulatory regulatory settings of countries. Particularly, for example, we see that there is a lot of undercutting of working conditions, which in fact relies upon the different forms of and ways in which self-employed is regulated. Polish self-employed with specific tasks and under civil law contracts have no obligation to pay social contribution, which can be not the case for Belgium self-employed, and this creates a lot of disturbances. But even within country, for example, in Italy, we see that this kind of existing labor market segmentation and fragmentation in different forms of regulatory setting for self-employed creates a lot of undercutting of working conditions. So what we conclude here is also by saying that regulatory setting also contribute a lot of underpinning unpaid labor in platform work. What are our little recommendation? Well, there is a lot here to say. I won't have the time to go line by line, but there are two main things here very important. The first thing is that, first of all, it is very important if we want to reduce unpaid labor in platform work. Okay, reclassification of employment status is important, but it's not the only conditions. We need to also try to guarantee minimum standards, not only in terms of pay, but also in terms of time. Therefore, we need also to adapt the working time directive to platform work. And we also need to ensure workers' voice mechanisms, particularly collective bargaining, not only for food delivery workers, but also for freelancers. This is very important because we see that the freelancers, particularly in the new directive on platform work, they are completely forgotten. Although the directive says that they cover or covers a lot, but de facto, we see that this part of the population of platform workers is not covered enough. And therefore, when we talk about voice, we refer particularly to transparency of information, data transparency, and portability. And here the situation of the CV and portfolio is very important. We see that this lock-in effect of reputation lock-in effect creates a lot of really a very dangerous situation for freelancers. And for those who want to read a bit more about our studies, I just put there 2 publications of ours, and so please feel free to have a look at it. And sorry, I had to go very fast along all.
So thanks, Valeria, for your talk. So we have time for questions. Ronald has the first question. Would you like to ask yourself?
Yes, our freelancer cover. Well, yeah, that's the kind of problem that we see. De facto not, they are not able to arrange their own rates. And that's why we see the big problematic that freelancers they experience on platforms. Yes, absolutely. And there is a lot of the unpaid that comes from, and also the fact that the technology in terms of, we see also now, I've presented here, I didn't have the time to go through all the platform. For example, we see a lot of differences across platform, which reflects also the different ways in which platform organize work in their own different ways, which also has an important impact. For example, the case of Yellow is quite interesting in comparison with Upwork, where we see that on Yellow, freelancers basically they have a bit of more possibilities for setting their rates in comparison to Upwork workers.
I think it would be interesting to make this explicit, or even more explicit than you've probably already done. That there's a sort of a communicating vessels type of thing going on, whether you have unpaid work, and you can allow for a bit of unpaid work if you have some capability of setting your tariffs a bit higher. Because that's what construction workers do, that's what plumbers do, that's what also people that work on platforms for the restaurant industry in the Netherlands, they might do some unpaid work, but they can set relatively high rates in compensation for that. So that I think it would make sense to check that also in all the things that you've done so far, if you haven't done so already.
Well, no, thank you very much. We do have a paper at the very moment on which we are working, where we set this very clearly. Yes, now I didn't have the time to get into more details, but absolutely. And we see that that creates a lot of precarity for the worker. Yeah.
Okay, Damien posed another question.
You want me to ask it?
Yeah, maybe.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I just
Better
wanted to
please.
fuel a little bit of discussion, because I myself do this as well. Many researchers focus on platform work specifically, but is this more narrow focus actually warranted? Or should there be more attention for precarity in non-standard employment more generally, as Ronald just discussed?
Well, I think that the two things, they don't contradict one another, because if you go and look at what are the employment status of those workers on platform work, you see that in most of the cases, those are not standard forms of work. I mean, these are self-employed, misclassified self-employed. In very few tiny cases, you see that they are employees, like, for takeaway, they are, hourly paid, but still with a lot of problematics in terms of guaranteed working hours and shifts, which creates a lot of precarity also for them. So I would say, well, I would say certainly it really depends, it depends what you want to achieve. I think now the very moment there is a lot of focus on the gig economy because of these, this is a new forms of work emerging and which are growing, and there is a lot of interest. And I think there is certainly the necessity to bring some novelty there in terms of trying also to kind of develop some awareness for policymakers and also for the workers themselves, because workers sometimes they don't know. Look, for example, Deliveroo workers, Deliveroo managers, they said to us, our workers, they don't want to be classified as employees. We don't discuss that they might not want to be classified as employees, but the question is that we see that other platforms, for example, Takeaway, they give attribute freedom to them and also flexibility to a certain extent, but they classify them as employees. So there are a lot of discrepancies here that I think are quite interesting to be pointed to and to be uncovered. Absolutely. But I see your point, yeah.
Ronald also has his hand up.
No, thank you for the question, Damien. I think it is valid to look into platform work and gig work and what have you, because it is the temporary endpoint of two developments. One of them is flexibilization and gigification of work, let's say. So this is sort of the canary in the coal mine. This is the direction that the labor market is taking, and we should be aware of that. And so therefore it's valid to look into it. But at the same time, you can point that we're having discussions about platform work now that we had about temp agency work 30, 40 years ago. And we have very similar policy discussions about this, and whether we forbid it, do we regulate it, and stuff like that. So it's very interesting to also have the broader picture of non-regular employment in general.
Thanks.
Okay, Vladimir.
Hey, hi, thank you so much for your presentation, Valeria. My question is actually how workers' agency features in your research, because you were talking a lot about protection, and you were talking about the new platform work directive and all these things. And I was wondering how, so I at least got the impression a little bit of talking about these workers as some sort of passive body of workers that needs to be protected, but how do you consider agency in your project and in your work, and also all kinds of collective struggles and how it relates to existing kinds of collective struggles? Like, for example, unions have been doing and undertaking different kind of initiative regarding platform work. There's been some grassroots organizing among and within platform workers themselves. So how does relate to the work you're doing? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vladimir. Well, we do consider agency, but not in a kind of sociological point of view, in the sense for agency in our work, as I mentioned now in the presentation, very much comes through the capacity that workers they have to have discretion on the conditions of their own work. That's what it is, It's not just because people tell me what to do. I mean, that's what the sharing economy, platform economy should be. So if I am free, I should be able to decide myself, to be an agent, right? But de facto is not. And we see that this is not. The people at the end, workers at the end, they don't have this discretion capacity. Now, this links, in fact, to the issue of the struggle. Now, I know that Valeria will present afterwards, my same name, on that, so I don't want to anticipate. But, we are also dealing with these kind of issues. Now, it's a quite interesting, and also I would say perhaps it's a broad topic. Right. So I think that certainly we have seen that workers are able to organize themselves. There are a lot of examples in different countries where, these workers have been, particularly in the food, riders, but also Uber, transport. Now, with the support of communities, so there is plenty of literature out there which explains this kind of collective organization. Regarding the unions, well, I think that unions are not completely outside this box. Now, I might, raise a bit of a discussion here. The way in which unions relate to what are the interests of those workers needs to be, taken with a bit more attention, I think. Because it's not that unions are completely outside. We see also in Belgium, actually, there is a specific federation of ACV, for example, for organizing freelancers in general. So, I mean, it's a quite, I'm not saying that is, there is nothing that can be done better. But I also think that is a complex issue that, we need to have a bit more time in order to develop it. But thank you very much for the question. I don't know whether I, replied fully to what you were interested in here about. Yeah.
No, it's great. I appreciate your reflection. Thanks a lot.
So I see Maarten posed a question in the chat, but I suggest we keep this, as it were, on hold for a bit, because I want to make sure that for the third presentation, we also have enough time. So first, I would like to give another round of applause for Valeria. And then we move to the other Valeria for her presentation. And well, we know now already we have some problems with the slides, so.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Tim. So I try to share my screen. Okay, are you able to see it? Hope so. And so, can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Yes, okay, perfect. So thank you very much. Thanks to the organizer of the webinar to invite me. And so I'm currently working at the University of Milan. I'm a postdoc fellow, and I'm one of the members of the ERC project SHARE, so sizing the hybrid areas of work by representing self-employment. And so my previous, let's say my previous project, my previous research interest, just to briefly introduce myself, I have been working on precarious work, especially migrant labor, especially with us in a special focus of in Italy in sectors like agriculture, meat processing, Well, now I've been invited to this seminar to briefly present you the preliminary data of a field work that I've been conducting in the Netherlands as a member of the SHARE group. So studying forms of participation and organizing of solo self-employed workers in the Netherlands. In order, I conduct this field work in order to compare my data with those collected by my colleagues in other countries, which are also involved in a shared project, that are Italy, the UK, Germany, France, and Slovakia. So my aim in this presentation is going a bit in depth in the precarity as is it experienced by solo self-employed workers, but also going towards the topic that Vladimir was suggesting. So using also this presentation to give some insights on the forms of agency and collective action that are undertaken by solo self-employed workers. I see I'm not able to move the slide. Okay. So as we know from the literature and has been already said by those who spoke before me, in Europe we are facing a higher level of job insecurity, and so self-employed workers are among those precarious work. The literature mainly deal, especially recently, mainly deal with what is called bogus self-employment. So both in traditional sector like construction, but also, as we just heard, in platform work, but also for what concerns those that we can call the genuine self-employers. So those who are actually independent, who are able to autonomously organize their their working time. We are also they are also facing a process of precarization of their condition, which basically means difficulty to negotiate their fees and difficulties to set their deadlines, intensification of their work performance, because to keep a stable income, and pandemic was just the last episode of this. So for them it's necessary or to extend the working hours or to hold more than one job at the same time, or in any case to increase their performance. And also compared to employed workers, as we know, solo self-employed workers lack social protections, lack the access to social protection, especially unemployment benefits, but also maternity leaves and other forms of health and disability insurances and so on. And moreover, in several European countries, solo self-employed workers lack the recognition and representation in the industrial relation arena. So in the majority of the countries, of the European countries, both on the side of trade unions and of the employer organization, there is, they both neglect, let's say, the specific interests of solo self-employed workers. Actually, this is not the case of the Netherlands specifically, because in this country, since the 2000, industrial relation arena has been adapted, let's say, to take into consideration the specific interests of self-employment. Let's think about, I don't know, like traditional unions, like for example the FMV, that decide to broaden their target also to include solo self-employed. So create this FMVs and standing, and or we know that there are platforms like the PZO, which are specifically representing the interest of self-employment. So there is a variety of organization in this context, but and there are also more, let's say, grassroots and self-organized groups. But the majority of the organization in this field is actually showing that like a similar approach. So first of all, they are usually oriented towards negotiation. So they towards a non-conflicting approach. They share a non-conflicting approach in the political arena. And these practices, they usually develop, these practices helpful to develop self-employment training and networking activities, or also to provide services, for example, discount for health and disability insurances, or legal advice, and so on. So my fieldwork was mainly oriented to looking in depth at this form of organizing, to try to explore how self-employed workers that usually are isolated individuals, how they come together to raise their claims. So by whom and how are they represented, and which practice do they develop? And within the project Share, we try to frame these empirical studies using the framework of the hybridity in order to better understand these new collective actors and their practice. So my fieldwork actually, I was thinking on the result from a previous phase of the fieldwork that was conducted by one of my colleagues that tried in 2019 to map, let's say, the organization of solo self-employment in the Netherlands. While my fieldwork were really recent, so from September to December 2021, and I still continue interviewing self-employed workers mainly online till a few days ago, let's say till February. So the research is still ongoing. I've been collecting till now 55 interviews, mainly with K-Informal and solo self-employed workers. But today, due also of the time constriction, I decided to present just one case studies in my fieldwork, which is an organization and initiatives of a group of sworn interpreters and translators. And yeah, I decided to present this case because it was quite striking for me, because this group, as I will briefly present, it's using quite conflictual strategies. They are using, they are demonstrating in several Dutch cities, but also they took up a strike, so work refusal in order to challenge their status quo, their current condition. So basically, the Orde is a very recent born organization. It born in December 2020, but some of their members were already active since the end of the 90s, also within the bigger organization for translators and interpreters in the Netherlands, which is the NGTV. But a group, like, let's say, a group of unorganized or autonomous workers set up this informal group that was called the Action Group for Registered Translators and Interpreter in 2019. And this group was actually undertake an industrial action. They organized this strike in January 2019 that to which around 1,500 translators and interpreters took part. And slowly, this informal group grew up and developed in a formal organization that is now the Orde, which has around 600 members, a president, a board. It's organized through language groups and through commissions that deal with the transversal topic. So since it was born in December 2020, the Orde has organized two main waves of demonstration. One, it was in October 2021, and the last one in February 2022. That include public assemblies, petition, media campaign, and demonstration in several Dutch cities. They usually demonstrate in front of courts, public immigration office, in front of the police, because let's say that the government is the main interlocutor of the protest, no? Together with these forms of protest, so another important action has been as I anticipate, the strikes that they've been conducting, usually refusing the job proposed by the public administration, by the government. At the beginning, the strikes was held for specific weeks during the year, but then it becomes, let's say, what we can define like an hiccup strike. So members of the Orde refuse to work on specific day each month. They refuse the proposal by the government. So let's try to see why they mobilize. So as I said, the majority of sworn interpreters and translators, especially for some specific group language, like for example, Turkish or Arabic, their work is mainly needed into public services, public administration, like immigration service, like police, like court. And what happens in the last few years is that the government has tried and is actually implementing a system of that aims at progressively outsourcing these services in favor of and implementing tenders in favor of large intermediaries, so agencies and big intermediaries that somehow that then they contact independent interpreters and translators. But this mechanism is highly reduced the possibility of interpreters and translators to negotiate their fees. And according to the board members, this will lead to lowering the quality of their job, first of all, but also the quality standards of the services. And this is also due to the fact that these big intermediaries and these agencies are able to pay interpreters and translators according to which is the minimum tariff that is established by law, tariff that are drastically low because they haven't been indexed since 1981 for the interpreters and since 1963 for the translators. I skip on this. I move towards like the practices of this organization. I already said that they use the strike, which is a practice that is in continuity with the possibility of the solo self-employed worker to say no to their clients. But they also rely on demonstration in order to make their claim more visible, also to somehow in contrast with the invisibility that is a characteristic of this kind of work. So many of my interviewees say that if you have a good interpreter, a good translator, you are not able to see them, no? Their work is invisible. So demonstration, also wearing this red cloth, is a way of raising their claim or making them visible. Moreover, they rely on campaigns, on petition, on inquiries, on labor conditions of translators and interpreters. This is an example. I would like to show you this. This is one of the flyers. This is an example of the campaign that this group is currently carrying on, which is a campaign that try to really shedding light on the importance of the professionality of this group of workers. No? And finally, another strategy has been those of trying to build up alliances and solidarities also with politicians, for example, members of the parliament, and also with other subjects, with other actors, with other organizations of professionals, like, for example, lawyers, judges, journalists, both in the Netherlands, but also abroad. So the last two slides, and then I'm going to conclude. So what kind of goals have they achieved so far? So first of all, they've been able to increase their visibility, the visibility of their claims, but also to create a common identity and a sense of solidarity between sworn interpreters and translators. So somehow combining the idea of an entrepreneurial self with also an idea of common a solidarity. So speaking about a self-realization within a network of people. They've been able to raise their voice and to somehow increase the representation of solo self-employed workers, doing it through a more conflicting attitude. So somehow in contrast with the Dutch institutional system, which is generally corporativist and concertative, so with a low level of conflict generally. And last but not least, they have not yet succeeded in improving their working condition, but for sure they succeeded in somehow questioning the status quo. Questioning the status quo regarding their fees, their working condition, and somehow openly opposing the neoliberal competitive free market logic. So to conclude, so I use the case of Orde in a twofold sense, on a twofold direction. So on the one hand, it taking seriously their claims of the reason why they protest, it was for me useful to show you a specific configuration of precarity, how it is experienced by this specific peculiar group of workers. And also, like, it was an example of how solo self-employed workers are able to organize it, to undertake collective action. So we can consider order as an hybrid form of organizing, because, of course, by using strikes and demonstration, they somehow hybridize the practices which are typical of solo self-employed organization, because they opening up, they use as practices also tools and practices which are usually adopted by unions and social movements. And moreover, in their discourse, they are able to overcome the binary distinction between employment and self-employees and autonomous worker by somehow combining in a fruitful way an idea of entrepreneurship with that of solidarity. So thank you very much for your attention. And I also would like to thank all my research participants, also because I have seen that some of my research participants are now listening to this presentation. So I would be really interested in having their comments and their ideas about this work. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks for your presentation, Valeria. So now we have some time for questions for the third talk. Is there anyone who would like to start? If not, yeah, Patricia.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Valeria, second Valeria, for your presentation. Also, very, very interesting. Also because it's about the strategy and how they change and how they are individualized, but then they become collective. I'm working on similar topics, so I find it fascinating. I was wondering how, also you mentioned that some of the people are in the call now, right? Mm-hmm. How did you work with them, and does your analysis is of any use to them to further organizing what they are doing, or how did you structure the relationship? Because yeah, we mm-hmm. also have a role, right, as researchers, and of course there is the research itself. But did they learn from your reflection and your analysis to further organize themselves? Or maybe the person in the call can also react.
Yeah. Thank you, Patricia, for this very interesting question. And yeah, for me, I've been dealing with ethnographic methods, this kind of research that is micro, that is empirically grounded, and of course also engaged for many years. So I feel familiar with your topic. I have to say that this was first time for me that I was conducting a field work abroad. So in a field that I didn't know before, with actors that I didn't know in advance, and also in a period that was under the lockdown, so not very easy to meet each other and to progress in, let's say, yeah, in a more open debate about this issue. I think the type of relationship could develop, and is what I really aim, because it's what actually makes our research having a name, no? To come, like, to be useful for people in order to again bring back this reflection to their way of organizing. So honestly, now I'm at a very early stage of the research. I'm just still conducting the interview, but I hope that this was, for example, an occasion for me to invite people to join the conversation. It is so a first occasion to discuss them. I'm very, very keen on these aspects, generally speaking, and I think is the aim of our research as a research which is engaged with with labor condition and with improving labor conditions. So thanks for this analysis.
Okay, then Valeria Pulignano has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Valeria. I'm kind of interested in knowing a bit more about, you mentioned the outsourcing practices, which is something very interesting, important, really. Did you also find that the introduction or the changes in technology, artificial intelligence, for example, how did they impact on the work experiences of these translators? And also the fact that, as we do know, translators, everybody fundamentally, now I might say something wrong, but you don't need a specific diploma to be translator. Everybody can. So and these creates a lot of disturbances in competition. At least this came also in our research within the Respect Me. This kind of really being pushed into the cage, if you like, where competition occurs. So I was just wondering whether you have similar findings there. Thank you.
Concerning technological changes, I think this sector, especially translation, was affected very much about the introduction of Google Translate, all of these let's say automatic translators. Also in the way the agencies then set up labor condition, because they often offer a lower price to translators if they're, let's say, if this document result to be partially already translated. So this for sure affected the labor condition. In the case of sworn interpreters and translators, a bit less, because especially interpreters, they need to be live or in this last period on platform, but there is still a need of a person, let's say. And in any case, yeah, this changing technologies is affecting the labor market, but is also a possibility for workers. There is also a possibility for workers to use this instrument in order to make their work quicker, and so like in terms of income and fees, earn a bit more. So yeah, as usual, technologies affects, but it's also how it is used that somehow can improve or worse labor condition, as we know already. And in this specific case, there was less, it was less relevant because of the interpreting side, which is still live. What was the second point was more about the fact that these groups doesn't need a diploma, no, so they don't need a specific diploma, and this aspect is very much pointed out, for example, by all the members. That somehow, in this sense, I try to we frame this organization as an hybrid organization, because on the one hand they are using the strategies and also the discourse of a union, no? So, or a social movement, so strike, demonstration, but on the other hand they point out very much, and they try to shed lights on the specific need of being professional. So they try to, so even if they doesn't exist a proper register of, in the case of sworn interpreters and translators, there exists a register. So there is somehow a legal frame. But for example, what is happening is that the government in the last few years, and I think it has implemented really recently, they open up this register also for professional with a lower language proficiency. So not just C1 as was the standard nowadays, but also B2. So they are trying to lowering the, let's say, the quality, the standard needed to join into the labor market. And some of my interviewees say that is, of course, an open strategy to somehow open up, to increase the pool of workers who are able to become to be translators, and so to be engaged for a lower fee or a lower to work for a minimum tariff. So yeah, this topic of the quality and the importance of recognizing the professionalities is really one of the main aspects of Order, but also of other organizations protecting the interest of interpreters and translators. I hope I have replied to your question, or have.
There was a question from Damien.
Hi,
Yes.
Damien.
Hey,
Nice to see
nice
you.
to see you again.
Nice to see you again.
But yeah, so probably your research was not really focused on this, as I know.
Mhm.
But does your analysis tell anything about the effectiveness of this social movement, unionism, compared to more institutionalized and formal forms of unions?
Broad question. So as I tried to show, like the effectiveness is not just about I don't know, results in terms of improving labor conditions. This is I don't think this is the only achievement that this mobilization have. Of course, this would be really relevant, but also the fact that these claims are raised, that the visibility is obtained, and also I think it's really relevant the fact that the group of people are able to come together and overcome their individualization as workers and come together to somehow also improving their networking and also improving their condition in the labor market. So I think these are all positive effects that spill over, let's say, these forms of organizing. So, and if there is more effective through formal unionism or through grassroots movements, this is hard to say. Like I think both have important roles. Like while formal unionism is much more, for example, engaged in collective bargaining, which have effect of all workers, not just on members. These organizations were more focused maybe on membership. They somehow have the spillover effect that was described, so increasing visibility, increasing engagement, and increasing awareness among smaller group of people. So I think they are both somehow relevant to, like, the more the claim is various, the more there is representation in the public arena, I would say.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Okay, anyone else with a question? If not, then maybe it's a good idea to open up the floor for general questions. So if you have any other questions for previous speakers, for all speakers, this might be a good time. Maarten had a question before, but I see that the debate has already been going on in the chat. So I'm not sure whether that's still necessary to, or if so, Maarten can.
No, that's fine. My question was adequately answered. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Anyone else?
I can always just restate my question that Ronald already answered a bit in the chat. So that these flexible forms of work, they have been around for ages, I think, even to such an extent that what we call standard work is actually historically has been non-standard. It's quite unique. So I also wonder that how much of this recent shift in narratives around non-standard work, going from something that's a positive thing to more this focus on precarity, and also the scrutiny by researchers of platform work, and how much it has to do with just higher educated people entering this sort of work. And then I also already pointed out, like, my own counterpoint to this thesis, that well-educated creative workers, they've kind of have been the original gig workers to some extent. So yeah, I'm curious to hear if maybe one of the Valerias also has some thoughts on this point.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, first of all, on the no standard forms of work. Well, let's start to put a bit of order. Flexibility, we know, is not flexibility per se, at least that's my personal view, that creates precarity. Is what kind of flexibility you implement, and again, to what extent this flexibility empowers or gives opportunity to workers to keep control on their own working conditions. And that's what it is. Now, of course, we do know capital and labor, there is an imbalance of power there. You know, you cannot give both, but you can equilibrate, right? And this is what happened in the kind of welfare, under the kind of welfare state, modern, whatever you want to call it, right? So where compromise, social compromise was made between the different social partners in order to. Now, what we have seen since the last decades has been a progressive shifting of, in fact, and this is not what I say, this is what many scholars up there, they say, shifting of responsibility from the employers and the state on individuals. And this is what creates a lot of troubles. You cannot think that now, independently from the employment status, from the flexibility, from all the structures we have out there, I mean, you cannot give to the individuals, you know, the kind of responsibility that you as a state or as an employer should have, right? And this is, I think, to me, the crucial point. Now, whatever you want to call it, in every part of the labor market, whatever kind of sector, more regulated, less regulated, the platform economy whatsoever, that is the crucial things. And what we see now in the new, let's say the new forms of work, not the platform economy, just the new forms of work, the emergence of these new forms of work, you see these really, you know, kind of pervading. People talk about, a lot of sociologists, Boltanski and Chiappello and many others, they talk about this you have to be accountable, right? And we know the neoliberal logic, they rely on this because, you know, the measurement, so everything is to be measured, you have to be accountable, you have to be, this is something that doesn't work. At the end of the day, this creates a lot of destabilization and a lot of, is not sustainable basically socially, right? And creates a lot of problems, but not only to the individuals per se and to the people in the labor market, but also to people outside and also to their own families. Now, as I mentioned at the very beginning, at least the research we are developing at the very moment shows that in fact, this is a very, very problematic issue in our society nowadays. And so I mean, at least that's the kind of, if you like, I don't know, the message I would give now, independently from structures and agents and whatsoever. But that is the major element, I think, at least personally, I do think.
So one of the other speakers who wants to comment on this as well, or?
I could repeat the arguments that I already made in the chat, that there are different ways to look at that there's more and newer forms of flexible employment, and they are more or less precarious, and they are more or less problematic as well, because as a lot of platforms are claiming, and this is partly true, a lot of the workers that work on platforms are actually quite happy, and they don't feel a lack of agency or whatever at all. And that is in particularly true for people that are still in school or in university and do this on the side. So it is an easy entrance to the labor market, that a lot of entrants to the labor market feel they don't need agency there. And they're ruining it for everybody else on the labor market. So we shouldn't allow it. But there is some basis in that these new forms of employment are suitable for some people at some stage in their working life. And if, as long as they're paying the minimum wage and and the work is safe and otherwise of the required quality, then there really is no problem for the people involved. The problem arises only when this is eating into the regular part of the labor market, and people that are dependent on income and jobs and need them to support their families also are required to work on this basis. And this is what it makes it very hard to develop policies. This is very hard to uphold the law in this respect, because if you allow students to work like this, why shouldn't you let other people work like this? So it makes things very complicated, and this is why the project like these and research that we have seen presented here is so important, because it is a very slippery subject, both in terms of what is happening and is it positive or is it negative, so it's I've been involved in research into flexible labor now for 25 years, and back then I thought, well, maybe this is a subject I can dig into for 4 years, and as it turns out, this is a topic that I will stay with me for the rest of my working life probably, and it's very important for our societies that we do this well, and that we do this research well, and show policymakers and show the general public what is going on and what is a good thing and what is a bad thing.
Okay, I see that it's 6 o'clock, and this is, oh no, Maarten has a.
Yeah, if there's time, if it's dinner time, that's fine as well.
Brief.
Oh well, well, maybe the answer can be brief. I think we've sort of gotten into this discussion where we're sort of discussing the necessity of change for these flexible labor aspects of society. But I guess I have a background in cultural theory, so sorry for forcing it this way. I feel there's also society creates, especially in consumer culture, a necessity for this flexible labor. All these sort of luxury aspects of fast groceries and fast cab rides. I feel like, especially if we need these people in, let's say, the installing of solar panels, what needs to sort of change? Is there anything you could say about that? What needs to change in that respect in the culture of consumption to sustain such change?
Well, I think there's a higher societal need for more durable forms of energy than we have for flash delivery of lettuce and what have you.
Yeah.
But if we leave this to the capitalist system we call the market, then it does not happen unless people have the opportunity to not being dependent on this flash delivery work.
Right.
But there is really the employers in installing solar panels are actually giving better jobs than delivering groceries. So and this system of a market and of a labor market is very difficult to sort of govern and to you cannot push buttons and arrive at the outcome you want. So there is well, again, we need all this research, we need all this stuff we're discussing here.
Right. All right. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. I guess it sort of implies these far-reaching interventions into these markets to sustain that. So so I guess quickly, would it be enough to make these very attractive, and then do you see this as a possibility, right? In these constraints, let's say you want to have immigrants move into these jobs, right? Installing solar panels. There's a political sort of objection, perhaps, from parties that would be, yeah. So we need to formulate that this needs to happen, but maybe I'm too pessimistic. But I guess that's, yeah. Is that a real possibility? Oh, your mic is off.
I really don't have a good answer to that. I see the problem. I see the problem, and it is difficult to sort of push buttons and arrive at the outcome you want, because especially if other people want other outcomes,
Right.
we still have a problem here.
Thank you.
Okay, Valeria, and after Valeria, I suggest that we'll end.
Yeah, very, very quickly, because I think Martin and Ronald, they raised the issue, I think, of the green economy, the carbonization. Now, there is a lot of attention on, in fact, the question is not the jobs per se that they disappear and who is doing the jobs, but the question, in fact, is that all these jobs will be disappearing, will be shifting in other sectors. People will be doing other stuff. For example, in the automobile industry now, at the very moment, there is a lot of creation of these battery plants. Don't know whether you have heard. And the conditions under which workers work in these battery plants are awful. In Hungary, there is one, which is really, better not to go there and look at the job quality of the, how these workers are working there. Now, the point is, governments are responsible also for what these workers are doing there, because at the end of the day, we are back there. So the role of the state, the political economy is very important, because at the end of the day, what you see there is that in order to attract capital from other countries, outside Europe, inside Europe, whatsoever, of course, you try to do it in such a way that you do it by undercutting working conditions in your own even country. So, and I can guarantee to you that, for example, in Sweden, they will also create perhaps battery plants where also migrant workers will work, but the condition will be different, right? So I think that we need, so when we think about decarbonization and all the consequences of it, we will to think also in terms of what this means in terms of the new constellation of, perhaps division of labor. We are back into what Wallenstein was talking about. I don't know, it's quite interesting. So I think it raises a lot of questions at the very moment, particularly on the quality of jobs and the quality of who does this work, really.
Okay, and so with this final comment on decarbonization, that's for me the perfect launching pad to talk about our next webinar, which will be about the role of cooperatives in greening the economy. And that will be on May 10. So for those interested, they can register and join for that event. So on that note, I would like to thank again all of our three speakers. And I hope you had a good time. And well, hopefully we see each other in person at one point in the future.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very nice to meet you all.
Me too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.